Hello, and welcome to the Everyday Business Problems Podcast. I'm your host, Dave Crysler. Each episode, we talk to business leaders and subject matter experts to learn about the challenges they've overcome and the challenges they still face. You'll hear fresh insights, real talk, and get inspiration to grow your business. If you've been part of any conversation about your ERP, there's a pretty reasonable chance that somebody has told you it's about time to replace it. Maybe as a vendor, maybe a consultant, maybe somebody on your own team who's tired of fighting it. And the impulse is certainly reasonable. But what I really want to talk about today is why it's almost always the wrong answer and what the right answer looks like instead. As I said, the replacement impulse is certainly reasonable, but here's why I've kind of found that it's almost always wrong, right? Vendors and consultants who are rooting for the replacement have a financial incentive that you may not realize, right? So their incentive for you to go through a digital transformation is pretty great because depending on the size of business you are responsible for or a part of, that could be, as little as mid five-figure investment to as much as a high 6 or 7-figure investment easily, right? So they obviously have a financial incentive to be able to, walk you through and get you interested in doing a digital transformation. And they do that all kinds of ways, talking about the latest and greatest, talking about moving from, on-prem back in the day to in the cloud and all of the advantages of that, talking about, these days, all of the AI enablement and AI-powered versions of their software. But at the end of the day, right, they are financially incented to get you excited about a digital transformation, right? The other thing that that I end up seeing happen is that the new ERP often is configured by the same processes that produced your current frustrations, right? So I've talked about this previously, but ultimately the challenge for any consultant or OEM that is doing a digital transformation or doing an uplift or doing anything of the such or of the sort, right? The biggest challenge that they have is understanding current state and reconfiguring that, right, in the new technology or tool. And so the challenge there is to not just talk about what do you want it to do, right, but it's to zoom out even further and to understand what is going to be different about your business in the next, 3, 5, 7, 10 years than it is today? Do we need to operate in a different way than we do currently, right? So it's even bigger than the tactical process execution, right? That's certainly a component of it, but the conversation is even more broad. And if you're not thinking through those things, or you haven't, found a partner to help you think through those things, you're kind of, back to point one, right? Setting yourself up for, a relatively large capital investment, with somebody that's incentivized to kind of drag that process on, right? So that's why I love, independent folks that have no affiliation with actual software. Because generally speaking, they are going to, guide through experience. Generally speaking, they're going to have, in the lowest case, tens, but, in the general case, probably hundreds of real world use cases that they can call on, examples, other businesses that operate in similar ways. They can talk about, what the growth trajectory looks like, all of these different things. That ultimately surface in an effective digital transformation, right? But going through that process, right? So I would say that, the kind of tacking onto that point, right? The thing that gets missed most often in terms of why there's frustration to begin with whatever existing tool you have, is because it would kind of miss the question of like, why is this thing set up this way to begin with? Right. And, we kind of gloss over or maybe don't know that, the answer is like, it's because that's how it was configured. Right. Like, but, to dive into that, it's really unpacking what do we need this thing to ultimately do for us? Right. I get into this conversation with some folks that represent, OEMs, and everybody says that their tool, their technology is the thing, right? They have the better mousetrap, they have the better widget, they can do this, they can do that. And from my perspective, like I'm always trying to keep things or make things as simple as possible. And in my mind, when we're talking about ERP specifically, it's a transaction aggregator, right? It's a giant calculator. It's no smarter than that, right? It takes a input, it does what you say to do based on your, business rules and processes, right? And then it provides an output. And then what you do with that output, usually exists outside of the ERP, right? So all it's doing is creating transactions, aggregating those transactions, right? Like that's what all the business logic is. That's what all the, the tables and data, that's what it all drives, right? So if there is some frustration around how it is currently working for your team, right? Chances are that's back to how it was configured, right? And chances are, if you are in the mid-market space, whether you're lower, upper, right, dead center, right? Chances are you have a solution that can be configured in a different way, right? So that is one of the things that makes ERP powerful. Is the fact that I should add to that. It makes it powerful, right? And it makes it challenging all at the same time because it can be configured in a multitude of ways, which is back to my first point in terms of why the consultants and OEMs are kind of financially incented to keep you into this process, right? And why they can sometimes struggle to draw out the right questions, right? Or draw out the right answers through their questioning when you're working through this process. But it's because of that, right? So one of the stories I'd love to tell kind of in this vein is we were working with a company. This is a large, so I would say that they were in the upper mid-market, certainly approaching the enterprise, size organization. This is a custom manufacturer, engineer to order manufacturer. And we're working with one of their specific divisions within the umbrella. And so the scenario was existing ERP kind of, this ERP stack kind of existed in a multitude of divisions and branches. So this is one of their corporate systems. And, kind of early stages, conversation, connecting with the team. Hey, there's lots of opportunities to kind of streamline some of the process flows, what we're actually doing with this tool, right? Lots of frustrations around kind of the day-to-day process flows that were being impacted due to the ERP, right? So naturally, one of the kind of questions on the table was, do we need a new ERP? And what I would say is, thankfully we had a conversation pretty early on in those conversations, right? In that, exploratory phase, I'll call it. And it was really quick, really clear to me really quickly that what we were kind of dealing with was a situation where, the tool had been implemented or configured based on a business model that this particular division was not utilizing, right? So I'll kind of go back to the way that it was configured and implemented. It was configured and implemented for a custom manufacturer. And while on the surface, all of the divisions kind of represented custom manufacturing, this kind of specific division was really centered around supply chain, inventory management, service of the equipment that was ultimately being manufactured. So they needed a different configuration because it was a different business model, right? So the process flows, the data configuration, all of the rules within the system, they didn't support what was actually happening in the business, right? So that's ultimately what, kind of led to, right? Like people utilizing tools that exist outside of the system, right? Before I get too far ahead of myself and get into that, just a bit of a continuation, right? Like, this was a company that grew through acquisition. And so it can certainly happen that way. It can happen because you've expanded into a new product line, right? You've increased market share and it's a slight, maybe offshoot or something like that, or complementary, maybe service component. There's a variety of reasons that you kind of get yourself to this point. But what I think is underneath all of it is kind of, where I started this part of the conversation is kind of like, why do we have it set up this way? Right. So again, for me, a lot of it comes back to like this disconnect of, where we're at from a leadership perspective and the folks that are kind of doing the day-to-day transaction work, and not enough conversations around like, hey, what are the things that are slowing you down and why? Right. I'll kind of, get back into where I was going with this conversation is like, you end up seeing a lot of workarounds, right? Like, I've not been into I'll say almost any business, right? Doesn't matter the size. I have some relatively small businesses that I have been in, worked with, been a part of, and some really big businesses. And I, off the top of my head, can't think of one that hasn't utilized, Excel or Google Sheets or some, other spreadsheet player to be named later, right? Like, that stuff exists because something is, not functioning as someone else might expect. Right. Now, what I've learned over the course of time is that sometimes it's a configuration issue. Sometimes it is a, kind of change management issue from the perspective of either that person doesn't feel enough confidence or comfort or doesn't know the functionality of the ERP. Maybe something's changed over the course of time that, that wasn't configured, that process flow wasn't built in, what have you. Maybe it's a comfort level within themselves of, I know Excel inside and out. I could build all kinds of crazy analytical things. So I just have a bigger comfort level in there, right? But my whole entire point is like, that's a clue. That's a clue that something isn't working as anticipated, especially at the leadership level, right? So if you're out on the floor, walking around, you're out in the office area, if you have a service-based business or, what have you, right? But getting at that tactical level, getting closest to the people that are doing the work to understand, like, where are the workarounds? Like, when are you having to pull this data out of this tool and do something different with it? Like, why? Why do we have to do that? What's the output that we're trying to get at that we can't easily get to utilizing, the existing tool set that we have? And again, some of that may be, the model has changed, something has expanded over the course of time. Right? It could just be additional configuration that needs to be done, right? A different way to implement the same tool. So ultimately, those are the kind of, questions and things that you should be thinking of. And, I think the other part of this is like, it's not never, right? Like, it's not never. The answer is it's not never, right? I think when some people hear me talk about, the fact that generally speaking, you don't probably need to replace your ERP. they're thinking in, absolutes. And for me, there is no real absolute, especially when it comes to this. I think where I end up seeing a lot of kind of a lot of good things happen is that we have these conversations, we kind of take a look at and do a bit of a independent audit of current state and start to unpack, like, is this tool supporting the existing model, the current model, right? Is this tool going to support, potential future models? How are we thinking about growing this business, right? Is this a business that we're already growing through acquisition? Does our tool support that? Are we going to have to worry about integrating whatever tools this acquisition facility is coming along with? Do we have a plan for that? How are we thinking through the transactions from here are going to be handled there, right? And vice versa, right? Where do the workarounds exist? Okay, like let's uncover and keep track of all the different Excel sheets and macros and stand-up tools. And today it's AI connections and data analysis that's happening, whether it's through a BI product or Claude Code, right? Or AI player to be named later. So it's all of those things. If we can get our hands kind of wrapped around that, what I really see a lot of kind of a lot of movement is that we can capture and kind of address a lot of the issues that are underlying to that. And maybe there is a case to be made that we need to upgrade for whatever reason. Maybe there's a case to be made we keep what we have existing and we find some other kind of best in breed bolt-on, right? And then we have, obviously configurability and connectivity between, systems, right? So there's a whole host of, other questions that get kicked off, if that's ultimately, what kind of where we drive, right? So, again, not to say it's not never, but more times than not, I think there's things that we can do with the existing tool set, optimizing process flows, looking at some automation, and things that are simple when you compare them to, the digital transformation option. Right. And again, there's a lot of talented folks that I know that are in this space that I would highly recommend if that's where you're at with things. But short of that, right, that's the work that I love to do and to have conversations around, because I think, one, I've just seen so much benefit from it. Two, I, grew up in an environment where capital was reserved for other things generally. And so we had to make do with what we had. And I think that that helped to spur creativity. And that's really what I like to think about, when I'm having these conversations with people, right? So a couple more points here before we wrap up. But, number one is that I talk about, ERP. I talk about, systemization through the lens of planning, people, process, technology, right? And when people are kind of navigating this conversation, they're kind of ultimately focused on the tech, the tool, right? This ERP, that ERP, right? And the conversation, as I alluded to earlier, is just so much broader, so much deeper, in the sense that if we don't spend kind of adequate time on that planning component, right, and understanding our business at a deep, deep level, understanding the trajectory of our business, where are we trying to go with our business, how we're trying to grow our business, right? If we don't spend an inordinate amount of time in that, and we jump to, the vendor demos and here's our current state process flows and just make it do this, right? We're really missing an opportunity, based on experience and in my opinion, right? Same thing on the people and process side of things, right? Like, who is going to ultimately be responsible to do these different process flows? How can we ultimately utilize their knowledge, their critical thought, their ability to create, these standalone kind of tools that they have been using and utilizing, right? Within Excel, within Google Sheets, within all these other kind of ancillary tool stacks, right? So tapping into that tribal knowledge, like those critical thinking elements to be able to leverage it, right? Same thing on the process side, right? Like they are creating their own optimized process flows in other tools. They're building their own systems. Okay, so we need to be able to understand those. So that helps to inform us, right, as we're on this journey, as we're thinking through what does make the most sense and what is really driving this, right? Like, why is this like bubbled up to the radar? Is this because you saw, a really amazing demo? You saw, a SaaS, OEM talking about the latest, greatest feature? Like, or is there a real business case that's underlying this? And then again, unpacking that, even longer, right? So I think, as we kind of wind this up, right? Like, the thing to think about is like, instead of thinking it through the lens of like, do we need to replace our ERP? That's like, how do we audit this thing to the nth degree to better understand if that's the pathway forward that's going to, kind of support our greater goals of growing this business? Or is it ultimately going to be, kind of a capital expense that is extremely distractive, extremely disruptive, and at the end of it, right, you're going to be left with something that kind of resembles what you currently have? Because unfortunately, that is the reality for many, many, many ERP, digital transformations, ERP upgrades, ERP uplifts. So that's my encouragement for you, is to take a real serious look at your existing tool stack, how that, ultimately integrates in terms of how I think through building effective systems, right? Planning, people, process, technology. And I would bet that you're going to be a lot further ahead, a lot faster. And at the end of that, if you do conclude that, a new ERP is the best way to go and you have the reasoning behind that, reach out in that case, because I have a few great partners that I'd love to intro you to that can help you navigate that process as pain-free as possible. But no, even with the best, even with the best partners out there, going through an ERP implementation, a selection, configuration, and implementation is going to be disruptive to your business. There's just no getting around that. So there's plenty of ways to mitigate that risk, and I certainly don't want to scare people away from doing it, because there's definitely reasons to do it, right? But know what you're getting into. And I don't think a lot of people put this type of content out really anywhere, because people don't want to talk about the unpleasantries that happen when things don't go to plan. And if I've learned anything over the course of now almost 30 years, when it comes to software selection, development, configuration, implementation, right? Stuff goes sideways, and it goes sideways more often than it doesn't. So, those are the things that you have to be realistic about when you're thinking through these types of scenarios. So if you have any questions, I'd love to have a conversation. Happy to give you some guidance and some, insight and perspective based on my experience. As a reminder, each one of the solo episodes is an extension of our free weekly newsletter, Business System Saturday. So I'd encourage you, if you found any value in this, would encourage you to go check that out and subscribe. Totally free to unsubscribe if you're not getting any value there. And again, thanks so much for tuning in, and I'll catch you on the next episode. Bye for now.
Thank you so much for listening today. If we brought you any value, please rate, subscribe, and share our podcast. Also, be sure to connect with us on social media by searching @The Crysler Club. Until next week, I'm your host, Dave Crysler.